pain, suffering, and survival. As he prepared to begin filming Iron Man in early 2007, the director Jon Favreau rented out a complex in Los Angeles that once belonged to Hughes Aircraft, the aerospace and defense contractor started about 80 years earlier by Howard Hughes. The facility had a series of interlocking hangars and served as a production office for the movie. It also supplied Robert Downey Jr., who was to play Iron Man, and his human creator Tony Stark, with a splash of inspiration. Downey felt nostalgic, looking at one of the larger hangars, which had fallen into a state of disrepair. Not too long ago, that building had played host to the big ideas of a big man who shook up industries and did things his own way. Downey heard some rumblings about a Hughes-like figure named Elon Musk who had constructed his own modern-day industrial complex about 10 miles away. Instead of visualizing how life might have been for Hughes, Downey could perhaps get a taste of the real thing. He set off in March 2007 for SpaceX's headquarters in El Segundo and wound up receiving a personal tour from Musk. "My mind is not easily blown, but this place and this guy were amazing," Downey said. To Downey, the SpaceX facility looked like a giant, exotic hardware store. Enthusiastic employees were zipping about, fiddling with an assortment of machines. Young white-collar engineers interacted with blue-collar assembly line workers, and they all seemed to share a genuine excitement for what they were doing. "It felt like a radical startup company," Downey said. After the initial tour, Downey came away pleased that the sets being hammered out at the Hughes factory did have parallels to the SpaceX factory. "Things didn't feel out of place," he said. Beyond the surroundings, Downey really wanted a peek inside Musk's psyche. The men walked, sat in Musk's office, and had lunch. Downey appreciated that Musk was not a foul-smelling, fidgety, whack job. What Downey picked up on instead were Musk's accessible eccentricities, and the feeling that he was an unpretentious sort who could work alongside the people in the factory. Both Musk and Stark were the type of men, according to Downey, who had seized an idea to live by and something to dedicate themselves to, and were not going to waste a moment. When he returned to the Iron Man production office, Downey asked that Favreau be sure to place a Tesla Roadster in Tony Stark's workshop. On a superficial level, this would symbolize that Stark was so cool and connected that he could get a Roadster before it even went on sale. On a deeper level, the car was to be placed as the nearest object to Stark's desk so that it formed something of a bond between the actor, the character, and Musk. "After meeting Elon and making him real to me, I felt like having his presence in the workshop," Downey said. They became contemporaries. Elon was someone Tony probably hung out with and partied with, or more likely they went on some weird jungle trek together to drink concoctions with the shamans. After Iron Man came out, Favreau began talking up Musk's role as the inspiration for Downey's interpretation of Tony Stark. It was a stretch on many levels. Musk is not exactly the type of guy who downs scotch in the back of a Humvee while part of a military convoy in Afghanistan. But the press lapped up the comparison, and Musk started to become more of a public figure. People who sort of knew him as that PayPal guy began to think of him as the rich, eccentric businessman behind SpaceX and Tesla. Musk enjoyed his rising profile. It fed his ego and provided some fun. He and Justine bought a house in Bel Air. Their neighbor to one side was Quincy Jones, the music producer, and their other neighbor was Joe Francis, the infamous creator of the Girls Gone Wild videos. Musk and some former PayPal executives, having settled their differences, produced Thank You for Smoking and used Musk's jet in the movie. While not a hard-drinking carouser, Musk took part in the Hollywood nightlife and its social scene. "There were just a lot of parties to go to," said Bill Lee, Musk's close friend. Elon was neighbors with two quasi-celebrities. "Our friends were making movies, and through this confluence of our networks, there was something to go out and do every night." In one interview, Musk calculated that his life had become 10% playboy and 90% engineer. 10. "We had a domestic staff of 5 during the day. Our home transformed into a workplace," Justine wrote in magazine article. "We went to black tie fundraisers and got the best tables at elite Hollywood nightclubs, with Paris Hilton and Leonardo DiCaprio partying next to us. When Google co-founder Larry Page got married on Richard Branson's private Caribbean island, we were there, hanging out in a villa with John Cusack and watching Bono pose. With swarms of adoring women outside the reception tent. Justine appeared to relish their status even more than Musk. A writer of fantasy fiction novels, she kept a blog detailing the couple's family life and their adventures on the town. In one entry, Justine had Musk saying that he'd prefer to sleep with Veronica than Betty from the Archie comics and that he'd like to visit a Chuck E. Cheese sometime. In another entry, she wrote about meeting Leonardo DiCaprio at a club and having him beg for a free Tesla Roadster, only to be turned down. Justine handed out nicknames to oft-occurring characters in the blog, so Bill Lee became Bill the Hotel Guy because he owns a hotel in the Dominican Republic, and Joe Francis appeared as Notorious Neighbor. It's hard to imagine Musk, who keeps to himself, hanging out with someone as ostentatious as Francis, but the men got along well. When Francis took over an amusement park for his birthday, Musk attended and then ended up partying at Francis's house. Justine wrote, "A was there for a bit but admitted he also found it kind of lame. He's been to a couple of parties at NN's house now and ends up feeling self-conscious because it just seems like there are always these skeevy guys wandering around the house trolling for girls. I don't want to be seen as one of those guys." When Francis got ready to buy a Roadster, he stopped by The Musk's house and handed over a yellow envelope worth $100,000 in cash. For a while, the blog provided a rare, welcome glimpse into the life of an unconventional CEO. Musk seemed charming. The public learned that he bought Justine a 19th century edition of Pride and Prejudice, that Musk's best friends gave him the nickname Alonius, and that Musk likes to place $1 wagers on all manner of things. Can you catch herpes from the Great Barrier Reef? Is it possible to balance two forks with a toothpick that he knows he will win? Justine told one story about Musk traveling to Necker Island, in the British Virgin Islands, to hang out with Tony Blair and Richard Branson. A photo of the three men appeared later in the press that depicted Musk with a vacant stare. This was ease. I'm thinking about a rocket problem stance, which makes me pretty sure that he had just gotten some kind of bothersome work-related email, and was clearly oblivious to the fact that a picture was being taken at all. She wrote, "This is also the reason I get sucked sick, a kick out of it, the spouse the camera caught is the exact spouse I encountered, say, last night en route to the bathroom, standing in the hallway frowning with his arms folded." Justine letting the world into the couple's bathroom should have served as a warning of things to come. Her blog would soon turn into one of Musk's worst nightmares. The press had not run into a guy like Musk for a very long time. His shine as an internet millionaire kept getting, well, shinier thanks to PayPal's ongoing success. He also had an element of mystery. There was the weird name, and there was the willingness to spend vast sums of money on spaceships and electric cars, which came across as a combination of daring, flamboyant, and downright flabbergasting. Elon Musk has been called part playboy, part space cowboy, an image hardly dispelled by a car collection that has boasted a Porsche 911 Turbo, 1967 Series 1 Jaguar, a Hammond BMW M5 Plus the aforementioned McLaren F1, which he has driven at up to 215 miles per hour on a private airstrip, a British reporter gushed in 2007. Then there was the Il-39 Soviet military jet, which he sold after becoming a father. The press had picked up on the fact that Musk tended to talk a huge game and then struggled to deliver on his promises in time, but they didn't much care. The game he talked was so much bigger than anyone else's that reporters were comfortable giving Musk leeway. Tesla became the darling of Silicon Valley's bloggers, who tracked its every move and were breathless in their coverage. Similarly, reporters covering SpaceX were overjoyed that a young, feisty company had arrived to needle Boeing, Lockheed, and, to a large extent, NASA. All Musk had to do was eventually bring some of these wondrous things he'd been funding to market. While Musk put on a good show for the public and press, he'd started to get very worried about his businesses. SpaceX's second launch attempt had failed, and the reports coming in from Tesla kept getting worse. Musk had started these two adventures with a fortune nearing $200 million and had chewed through more than half the money with little to show for it. As each Tesla delay turned into a PR fiasco, the Musk glow dimmed. People in Silicon Valley began to gossip about Musk's money problems. Reporters who months earlier had been heaping adulation on Musk turned on him. The New York Times picked up on Tesla's transmission problems. Automotive websites griped that the Roadster might never ship. By the end of 2007, things got downright nasty. Valleywag, Silicon Valley's gossip blog, began to take a particular interest in Musk. Owen Thomas, the site's lead writer, dug into the histories of Zip2 and PayPal and played up the times Musk was ousted as CEO to undermine some of his entrepreneurial street cred. Thomas then championed the premise that Musk was a master manipulator who played fast and loose with other people's money. It's wonderful that Musk has realized even a small part of his childhood fantasies, Thomas wrote. But he risks destroying his dreams by refusing to reconcile them with reality. Valleywag anointed the Tesla Roadster as its #1 fail of 2007 among technology companies. As his businesses and public persona suffered, Musk's home life degraded as well. His triplets, Kai, Damien, and Saxon, had arrived near the end of 2006 and joined their brothers Griffin and Xavier. According to Musk, Justine suffered from postpartum depression following the birth of the triplets. In the spring of 2007, our marriage was having real issues, Musk said. It was on the rocks. Justine's blog posts back up his sentiments. She described a much less romantic Musk and felt people treated her as an arm ornament who couldn't possibly have anything interesting to say, rather than as an author and her husband's equal. During one trip to St. Bart's, the Musks ended up sharing dinner with some wealthy, influential couples. When Justine let out her political views, one of the men at the table made a crack about her being so opinionated. A chuckled back, patted my hand the way you pat a child's, Justine wrote on her blog. From that point on, Justine ordered Musk to introduce her as a published novelist and not just his wife and mother of his children. The results? His way of doing this throughout the rest of the trip. Justine wants me to tell you that she's written novels, which made people look at me like, oh, that's just so cute, and didn't really help my case. As 2007 rolled into 2008, Musk's life became more tumultuous. Tesla basically had to start over on much of the Roadster, and SpaceX still had dozens of people living in Kwajalein awaiting the next launch of the Falcon 1. Both endeavors were vacuuming up Musk's money. He started selling off-priced possessions like the McLaren to generate extra cash. Musk tended to shield employees from the gravity of his fiscal situation by always encouraging them to do their best work. At the same time, he personally oversaw all significant purchases at both companies. Musk also trained employees to make the right trade-offs between spending money and productivity. This struck many of the SpaceX employees as a novel idea, since they were used to traditional aerospace companies that had huge, multi-year government contracts and no day-to-day survival pressure. Elon would always be at work on Sunday, and we had some chats where he laid out his philosophy, said Kevin Brogan, the early SpaceX employee. He would say that everything we did was a function of our burn rate and that we were burning through $100,000 per day. It was this very entrepreneurial, Silicon Valley way of thinking that none of the aerospace engineers in Los Angeles were dialed into. Sometimes he wouldn't let you buy a part for $2,000 because he expected you to find it cheaper or invent something cheaper. Other times, he wouldn't flinch at renting a plane for $90,000 to get something to Kwaj because it saved an entire workday, so it was worth it. He would place this urgency that he expected the revenue in 10 years to be $10 million a day, and that every day we were slower to achieve our goals was a day of missing out on that money. Musk had become all consumed with Tesla and SpaceX out of necessity, and there can be no doubt that this exacerbated the tensions in his marriage. The Musks had a team of nannies to help with their 5 children, but Elon could not spend much time at home. He worked 7 days a week and quite often split his time between Los Angeles and San Francisco. Justine needed a change. During moments of self-reflection, she felt sickened, perceiving herself a trophy wife. Justine longed to be Elon's partner again, and to feel some of that spark from their early days before life had turned so dazzling and demanding. It's not clear how much Musk let on to Justine about his dwindling bank account. She has long maintained that Musk kept her in the dark about the family's financial arrangements. But some of Musk's closest friends did get a glimpse into the worsening financial situation. In the first half of 2008, Antonio Gracias, TE, founder and CEO of Valor Equity, met Musk for dinner. Gracias had been an investor in Tesla and had become one of Musk's closest friends and allies, and he could see Musk agonizing over his future. Things were starting to be difficult with Justine, but they were still together, Gracias said. During that dinner, Elon said, "I will spend my last dollar on these companies. If we have to move into Justine's parents' basement, we'll do it." The option of moving in with Justine's parents expired on June 16, 2008, when Musk filed for divorce. The couple did not disclose the situation right away, although Justine left hints on her blog. In late June, she posted a quotation from Moby without any additional context: "There's no such thing as a well-adjusted public figure. If they were well-adjusted, they wouldn't try to be a public figure." The next entry had Justine house hunting for undisclosed reasons with Sharon Stone, and a couple of entries later, she talked about a major drama that she'd been dealing with. In September, Justine wrote her first blog post explicitly about the divorce, saying, "We had a good run. We married young, took it as far as we could, and now it is over." Valleywag naturally followed with a story about the divorce and noted that Musk had been seen out with a 20-something actress. The media coverage and divorce freed Justine to write about her private life in a much more liberated way. In the posts that followed, she gave her account of how the marriage ended, her views on Musk's girlfriend and future second wife, and the inner workings of the divorce proceedings. For the first time, the public had access to a deeply unpleasant portrayal of Musk and received some first-hand accounts, albeit from an ex-wife, of his hardline behavior. The writing may have been biased, but it provided a window into how Musk operated. Here's one post about the lead-up to the divorce and its rapid execution. "Divorce, for me, was like the bomb you set off when all other options have been exhausted. I had not yet given up on the diplomacy option, which was why I hadn't already filed. We were still in the early stages of marital counseling, 3 sessions total." Elon, however, took matters into his own hands. He tends to like to do that. "When he gave me an ultimatum, either we fixed the marriage today, or I will divorce you tomorrow." That night, and again the next morning, he asked me what I wanted to do. I stated emphatically that I was not ready to unleash the dogs of divorce. I suggested that we hold off for at least another week. Elon nodded, touched the top of my head, and left. Later that same morning, I tried to make a purchase and discovered that he had cut off my credit card, which is when I also knew that he had gone ahead and filed. As it was, A did not tell me directly, he had another person do it. For Musk, each online missive from Justine created another public relations crisis that added to the endless stream of issues faced by his companies. The image he'd sculpted over the years appeared ready to crumble alongside his businesses. It was a disaster scenario. Soon enough, the Musks had achieved celebrity divorce status. Mainstream outlets joined Valleywag in poring over court filings tied to the breakup, particularly as Justine fought for more money. During the PayPal days, Justine had signed a postnuptial agreement and now argued that she didn't really have the time or inclination to dig into the ramifications of the paperwork. Justine took to her blog in an entry titled "Gold Digger" and said she was fighting for a divorce settlement that would include their house, alimony, and child support, $6 million in cash, 10% of Musk's Tesla stock, 5% of Musk's SpaceX stock, and a Tesla Roadster. Justine also appeared on CNBC's show Divorce Wars and wrote an article for Marie Claire titled, "I Was a Starter Wife, Inside America's Messiest Divorce." The public tended to side with Justine during all of this and couldn't quite figure out why a billionaire was fighting his wife's seemingly fair requests. A major problem for Musk, of course, was that his assets were anything but liquid, with most of his net worth being tied up in Tesla and SpaceX stock. The couple eventually settled with Justine getting the house, $2 million in cash, minus her legal fees, $80,000 a month in alimony and child support for 17 years, and a Tesla Roadster. Asterisk. Years after the settlement, Justine still struggled to speak about her relationship with Musk. During a interview, she broke down in tears several times and needed moments to compose her thoughts. Musk, she said, had hidden many things from her during their marriage and ultimately treated her much like a business adversary to be conquered during the divorce. We were at war for a while, and when you go to war with Elon, it's pretty brutal, she said. Well, after their marriage ended, Justine continued to blog about Musk. She wrote about Riley and provided commentary on his parenting. One post gave Musk a hard time for banning stuffed animals from the house when their twins turned 7. Asked about this, Justine said, Elon is hardcore. He grew up in a tough culture and tough circumstances. He had to become very tough to not only thrive but to conquer the world. He doesn't want to raise soft, overprivileged kids with no direction. Comments like these seem to indicate that Justine still admired, or at least understood Musk's strong will. Asterisk. In the weeks after he first filed for divorce in mid-June of 2008, Musk tumbled into a deep funk. Bill Lee started to worry about his friend's mental state and, as one of Musk's more free-spirited friends, wanted to do something to cheer him up. Now and again, Musk and Lee, an investor, would take trips overseas and mix business and pleasure. The time was right for just such a journey, and they set off for London at the start of July. The decompression program began poorly. Musk and Lee visited the headquarters of Aston Martin to see the company's CEO and get a tour of his factory. The executive treated Musk like an amateur car builder, talking down to him and suggesting that he knew more about electric vehicles than anyone else on the planet. He was a complete douche, as Lee put it, and the men did their best to make a hasty exit back to central London. Along the way, Musk had a nagging stomach pain turned severe. At the time, Lee was married to Sarah Gore, the daughter of former Vice President Al Gore, who had been a medical student. And so he called her for advice. They decided that Musk might be suffering from appendicitis, and Lee took him to a medical clinic in the middle of a shopping mall. When the tests came back negative, Lee set to work trying to goad Musk into a night on the town. Elon didn't want to go out, and I didn't really either, Lee said. But I was like, no, come on. We're all the way here. Lee coaxed Musk into going to a club called Whiskey Mist, in Mayfair. People had packed the small, high-end dance spot and Musk wanted to leave after 10 minutes. The well-connected Lee texted a promoter friend of his, who pulled some strings to get Musk escorted into the VIP area. The promoter then reached out to some of his prettiest friends, including a 22-year-old up-and-coming actress named Tallulah Riley, and they soon arrived at the club as well. Riley and her two gorgeous friends had come from a charity gala and were in full-length, flowing gowns. Tallulah was in this huge Cinderella thing, Lee said. Musk and Riley were introduced by people at the club, and he perked at the sight of her dazzling figure. Musk and Riley sat at a table with their friends but immediately zeroed in on each other. Riley had just hit it big with her portrayal of Mary Bennett in Pride and Prejudice and thought of herself as quite the hotshot. The older Musk, meanwhile, took on the role of the soft-spoken, sweet engineer. He whipped out his phone and displayed photos of the Falcon 1 and Roadster, although Riley thought he had just done some work on these projects and didn't realize he ran the companies building the machines. I remember thinking that this guy probably didn't get to talk to young actresses a lot and that he seemed quite nervous. Riley said, I decided to be really nice to him and give him a nice evening. Little did I know that he'd spoken to a lot of pretty girls in his life. Asterisk. The more Musk and Riley talked, the more Lee egged them on. It was the first time in weeks that his friend appeared happy. His stomach didn't hurt, he's not bummed. This is great, Lee said. Despite being dressed for a fairy tale, Riley didn't fall in love with Musk at first sight. But she did become more impressed and intrigued as the night went on, particularly after the club promoter introduced Musk to a stunning model, and he politely said, hello, and then sat right back down. With Riley, I figured he couldn't be all bad after that, said Riley, who then allowed Musk to place his hand on her knee. Musk asked Riley out to dinner the next night, and she accepted. With her curvy figure, sultry eyes, and playful good girl demeanor, Riley was a budding film star but didn't really act the part. She grew up in the idyllic English countryside, went to a top school, and, until a week before she met Musk, had been living at home with her parents. After the night at Whiskey Mist, Riley called her family to tell them about the interesting guy she had met who builds rockets and cars. Her father used to head up the National Crime Squad and went straight to his computer to conduct the background check that illuminated Musk's resume as a married international playboy with 5 kids. Riley's father chided his daughter for being a fool, but she held out hope that Musk had an explanation and went to dinner with him anyway. Musk brought Lee to the dinner, and Riley brought her friend Tamsin Egerton, also a beautiful actress. Things were cooler throughout the meal as the group dined in a depressingly empty restaurant. Riley waited to see what Musk would bring up on his own. Eventually, he did announce his 5 sons and his pending divorce. The confession proved enough to keep Riley interested and curious about where things would lead. Following the meal, Musk and Riley broke off on their own. They went for a walk through Soho and then stopped at Café Bohème, where Riley, a lifelong teetotaler, sipped an apple juice. Musk kept Riley's attention, and the romance began in earnest. The couple had lunch the next day and then went to the White Cube, a modern art gallery, and then back to Musk's hotel room. Musk told Riley, a virgin, that he wanted to show her his rockets. I was skeptical, but he did actually show me rocket videos, she said. Once Musk went back to the United States, they kept in touch via email for a couple of weeks, and then Riley booked a flight to Los Angeles. I wasn't even thinking girlfriend or anything like that, Riley said. I was just having fun. Musk had other ideas. Riley had been in California for just 5 days when he made his move as they lay in bed talking in a tiny room at the Peninsula Hotel in Beverly Hills. He said, I don't want you to leave. I want you to marry me. I think I laughed. Then, he said, no. I'm serious. I'm sorry I don't have a ring. I said, we can shake on it if you like. And we did. I don't remember what I was thinking at the time, and all I can say is that I was 22. Riley had been a model daughter up to that point, never giving her parents much of anything to worry about. She did well at school, had scored some tremendous acting gigs, and had a soft, sweet personality that her friends described as Snow White brought to life. But there she was on the hotel's balcony, informing her parents that she had agreed to marry a man 14 years her senior, who had just filed for divorce from his first wife, had 5 kids and 2 companies, and she didn't even see how she could possibly love him after knowing him for a matter of weeks. I think my mother had a nervous breakdown, Riley said, but I had always been highly romantic, and it actually didn't strike me as that strange.